When Samuel Hayes finally came home after all those years, he thought the hardest part would be earning back his son's trust. But inside the old house, he froze. There was a stranger lying in the very bed that once belonged to him. Who had stepped into the space he left behind? And was there still time for Samuel to reclaim his place as a father, as a husband? Samuel Hayes came back on a late afternoon, his old truck groaning along the dry dirt road, every bump echoing like the years he had carried on his back. For so long, he had imagined this moment. He pictured the sagging porch where he once sat with coffee, the front door whining on its hinges, the faint smell of coal smoke still clinging to the walls. In his mind, it had always been the same home he had left behind. But as the truck turned onto the narrow lane and the house appeared in the dusk, reality struck with a harsher tone. The roof was streaked with moss, the porch leaned sideways, the windows were blotched with patches of age and weather. What froze him was not the decay, it was the pale yellow glow spilling out from inside. The house he had left in darkness now breathed with someone else's life. He cut the engine and sat motionless for a long time. His rough, calloused hand rested on the steering wheel, fingers curling tight as if they were holding something fragile enough to break at the slightest touch. He had always imagined Anna and Eli waiting behind that door, imagined the small boy running into his arms, the woman he once loved standing in the doorway. But that light, so warm, so casual, made him hesitate. In an instant, all the bright pictures he had kept alive in the desert heat and the sleepless barracks dissolved into smoke, scattered into the wind that swept across the fields. The front door was not locked. That detail, instead of comfort, sank into his chest like a stone. Out here in the country, people often left doors unlocked, trusting the silence of wide land and distance. But for Samuel, it was a signal, a message, a claim. Someone else belonged here now. He wrapped his hand around the doorknob, and the faint tremor in his grip betrayed the storm rolling inside him. When the door swung open, the air rushed out to meet him. It carried a smell both familiar and foreign. Not the stale wood and damp air that clung to the house the day he left, but the cleaner scent of soap, freshly washed sheets, the settled warmth of a home that was lived in daily. It struck his chest hard, a cruel reminder that time had not stopped for this place, even if it had for him. Samuel stepped into the living room. On the table sat a cup still breathing steam, alongside newspapers folded half open. Nothing extraordinary, yet that very ordinariness crushed him. Each detail whispered the same truth. Somebody else had been living his life while he was gone. He moved down the hallway. The air grew heavier there, shadows thick, broken only by the sliver of light leaking through a door at the far end. His boots pressed slow against the wooden floor, and with every step, his heartbeat pounded harder, drumming inside his chest until it rattled his ribs. The bedroom door stood ajar. He pushed it open with a steady hand. Inside, on the old bed, a man lay sleeping. His breathing was calm, deep, like someone utterly at home. The sight hit Samuel like a blow. This was not just any bed. It was the bed he once shared with his wife. The bed where he had sat through sleepless nights holding his son when the boy cried. The bed that carried the weight of countless memories, sweat, and silence. And now a stranger lay stretched across it, peaceful, unbothered, as if the past had been wiped clean. Blood rushed hot to Samuel's face, his legs locked, frozen mid-step. He could not tell if he should lunge forward and shake the man awake or turn and run before his own anger consumed him. His whole body went rigid, but his eyes were drawn to details, small things that screamed louder than shouts. The pillow carried the deep hollow of repeated use. The blanket was folded with care, too careful for a temporary stay. This was not an accident. This was not one night. This was replacement. Samuel did not act right away. His years in the service had drilled into him the danger of impulse. Rash decisions led to disasters. He steadied his breath, let his gaze sweep the room. Much of the furniture was the same, but some things had changed. A bronze desk lamp that had never been there, a book on the shelf he didn't recognize. On the nightstand sat a picture frame turned face down. Something inside compelled him forward. Each step felt like thunder in the silence, his boots pressing the floorboards, every creak echoing louder than gunfire. The man on the bed stirred, rolled slightly, but did not wake. Samuel froze, chest clamped, then continued. His hand reached for the frame. He turned it over. His heart nearly stopped. It was the wedding photograph, him in uniform, Anna in her white dress, smiling shyly into the lens, but his face was gone, cut out. The space where he had once stood was nothing but a jagged hole, raw and deliberate. The rest of the picture was preserved, as if someone wanted to keep the memory alive while erasing the man who once stood at its center. Samuel stood silent, staring into that void. His own absence stared back at him, a cruel reminder that he had once belonged and had now been erased with scissors and indifference. The frame in his hands trembled. A draft slid through the window crack, lifting the curtain, shadows rippling across the stranger's face as he slept. And in that ripple, Samuel saw the truth. In this house, he was nothing more than a shadow now, a ghost trespassing in the place he once called his own. He set the frame down, careful as though laying a fragile heart back onto the table. Then he backed away, each step slow, cautious, unwilling to leave even the faintest sound behind. His throat tightened, his chest pressed by a single weighty thought that seemed to hammer against his ribs. In this home that had once been his, was there still any place left for him? Samuel moved toward the kitchen, each step heavy, dragging behind it the weight of years lost. For so long, that room had been the heart of the house. He could still summon the sound of Anna's knife on the cutting board, the smell of bread rising in the oven, while Eli sat cross-legged on the floor, waiting, restless and hungry, his eyes fixed on the stove door as though the world depended on it. Samuel remembered the late nights too, when he sat in the wooden chair by the wall, watching mother and son fall asleep over unfinished plates, his cigarette burning to ash while he guarded them with a silence only soldiers know. The memories were so sharp, so alive, that he half believed if he stretched out his hand he could touch the laughter still hanging in the air. But when he stepped through the doorway, he knew at once this was no longer his kitchen. The fluorescent bulb above burned bright, casting a harsh light across a long dining table, polished to a mirror's gleam. The old wooden table, scarred with scratches from years of meals and arguments, was gone. In its place stood a slab of cold steel, smooth and spotless, reflecting back his face in a warped, ghost-like shimmer. Around it sat new leather chairs, lined in perfect order, not a single scratch, not a mark of use, not a trace of life lived. The shelves that once held blue-glazed bowls and chipped mugs were replaced by a regiment of white porcelain dishes, sterile, identical, lined like soldiers on parade. It was a kitchen dressed as a showroom, stripped of history, scrubbed of soul. Samuel lowered himself into one of the chairs, laying his hand flat against the steel surface. The metal was cold, unwelcoming, a surface that gave nothing back. In that moment, he felt less like a man returning home and more like a visitor trespassing in a house where his name had been erased. Every trace of his years here, the worn grooves, the knife marks, the warmth of hands had been cleaned away and replaced with this false perfection. His eyes fell on what the table carried, a half-finished glass of orange juice, ice melted to water, and a sandwich left bitten and abandoned. Ordinary things, but they cut deep, proof that life had gone on here day after day, indifferent to whether he had lived or died. His gaze drifted, unbidden, to the refrigerator. It was the same old model, its door still bearing the scar where Eli once carved lines with a kitchen knife, laughing at his own mischief. But now that surface was almost hidden, plastered with papers, notes, and photographs. Samuel stood and moved closer, drawn like a man stepping into a battlefield he already knew he would not win. There were snapshots of family picnics in the fields, pictures of Eli in classrooms, flashes of birthday dinners and evenings at the table. Each one was a moment he had not been there to see, slices of a life that had moved forward without him. Among them, one photograph stood out. Eli in a baseball uniform, awkward grin stretched across a boy's face, the uncertain pride of a 14-year-old caught between childhood and manhood. Samuel reached out, his fingers brushing the glossy surface, and his chest tightened. That was when he saw it. Beneath the picture, scrawled in thick black marker, were two words, Eli Turner. Samuel's body locked, his lungs emptied. The name hit him harder than any blast he had taken in the desert. Turner, not Hayes, not his name, not Anna's. Turner, the surname of the man who now lay sleeping in Samuel's bed. For a moment, the hum of the refrigerator roared in his ears, twisting into the sound of tank engines, the ground trembling as it had on long nights of war. The floor beneath him tilted, unsteady, as though the house itself was shaking him loose. He staggered back, the chair behind him groaning under his weight as he fell into it. Sweat broke across his forehead. His throat closed tight, choking him on nothing but air. His son, his blood, his flesh was now claimed by another man's name. Samuel sat slumped, burying his face in his hands. The white light overhead burned down mercilessly, but all he saw was darkness. The kitchen that had once been the warmest corner of this home had turned cold, merciless, delivering its verdict without need for words. He had been replaced not only in the bed he once shared with his wife, but in the very name his son carried. Samuel sat frozen in the kitchen, fists clenched tight on the cold steel table. His eyes refused to move from the words scrawled beneath the photograph on the refrigerator: Eli Turner. 2 words. Just 2 words, but they cut him deeper than shrapnel. They sliced through memory and marrow, through nights when he had cradled a feverish child in his arms, through mornings when the small voice called Daddy with sleepy innocence. All of it, every sacrifice, every sleepless vigil, seemed to have been erased by those 2 letters strung together in black ink: Turner. A sound crept down the hallway, the faint groan of a hinge, a slow step dragging across old wood. Samuel twisted toward it, breath caught. There, at the threshold, stood Mark Turner. He was no intruder startled awake, no man shaken by the sudden appearance of a ghost at his kitchen table. He wore simple sleep clothes, his hair mussed from the pillow, but his eyes held no trace of surprise, no fear, no fumbling excuses. Only the calm, steady look of a man who had expected this meeting all along. "You came back," Mark said, voice level, like he was greeting an acquaintance rather than facing the husband of the woman upstairs, the father of the boy sleeping in the next room. Then, narrowing his eyes, he allowed the faintest shadow of a smile. "I knew you would. I just didn't know it would be today." The words hit Samuel in a way he did not expect. For years he had run through this moment in his head. He had pictured shock, denial, anger, maybe fear. He had never pictured calm acceptance, as if Mark had rehearsed this conversation in advance. Samuel rose slowly, shoulders squared, chest rigid, like a soldier stepping back onto hostile ground. He did not answer. The fluorescent light above carved harsh lines into his face, catching the hollows worn deep by desert sun and battlefield dust. Every scar, every crease, seemed etched sharper by fatigue. Mark entered fully, the casual weight of ownership in his stride. He pulled a chair, sat down as though he had every right to it, poured himself water from the pitcher, and took a sip before meeting Samuel's stare. "How does it feel," he asked, tone even, "to see yourself replaced?" The words landed heavy. From anyone else, they might have been cruel, a blade to the gut. From Mark, they carried a strange inflection, not quite taunt, not quite test, more like a probe, a measured strike to find weakness. Samuel's hand tightened. His voice, when it came, was rough, each word dragged across stone. "This is my house." Mark tilted his head, set the glass down with deliberate care. "Yes, and it is also theirs, and I was here when you weren't." The silence between them thickened, heavier than the air before a storm. 2 men, 2 claims, sitting across the same table as if across a trench line, neither moving, neither yielding. After a long pause, Mark leaned back, lips curling with something that wasn't quite a smile. He reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a sheaf of wrinkled papers, and tossed them onto the table. "Do you know?" he asked softly. "Anna never signed the divorce." The words cracked the air. Samuel's eyes locked onto the stack, his pulse rising. He pulled the top sheet toward him, scanning. The divorce papers, his signature at the bottom, bold, final. But the line for Anna's name, the place where she was meant to sever the tie, was blank. His chest seized. Years ago, when he had left, he had received the envelope. He remembered the short, cold letter, the request for finality, the signature line. He had signed. He had mailed it back, thinking the chapter closed. And then he had drowned in sand and blood, never asking further questions. He had built his life around that assumption that she had signed, that their marriage had been ended. But she had not. Not legally, not on paper. Mark leaned forward, resting his elbow on the steel, his eyes glinting with a thin edge of irony. Funny, isn't it? By law, you are still Anna's husband. By law, you are still Eli's father. But look around. Paper doesn't tuck him in at night. Paper doesn't sit across this table. Paper doesn't answer when he calls. Dad, your name is in the files, but mine is the one spoken every day inside these walls. The words seared. Samuel's chest flared with heat. His palm slammed down on the table, rattling the glass, sending water spilling across the steel. His voice broke out rough, raw. What do you want? Mark didn't flinch, didn't blink. He only held the stare, calm as stone. I want nothing. I only want you to understand. Some things cannot be held by signatures. Some gaps cannot be filled by law. You left. I stayed. And presence sometimes outweighs a name on paper. Samuel's breath raged inside him, but no sound came out. Those words, bitter as they were, carried shards of truth he could not deny. He had been gone, while Anna shouldered the years alone. While Eli stumbled through growing pains without his father's hand. The role he abandoned had been filled not by choice, perhaps, but by necessity. And now, the proof of that substitution sat across from him. The curtain at the window lifted with a breeze, a soft ripple like an old reminder whispering through the night. Mark rose from his chair and crossed to the refrigerator. His fingers brushed the photograph of Eli in his uniform, the awkward smile of a boy not yet sure of his own body. A smile flickered across Mark's lips, half pride, half claim. Eli Turner, he said deliberately, letting the syllables linger. That's what he answers to. That's the name he knows when he calls for his father. And even if you've come back, that isn't something you erase with ink or memory. Samuel's hands balled white, the knuckles straining like bones ready to split. Every part of him wanted to lunge forward, to shout, to rip that certainty away. But combat had taught him rage, wasted bullets, wasted breath. Patience held power. He swallowed hard, forcing the fire down into coals, and when he finally spoke, the words came low, controlled, ground out between teeth. Do not misuse my son's trust. Basins. Mark only shrugged, indifferent, and walked toward the hall. He did not answer. His footsteps carried steady up the stairs, fading, leaving the kitchen hollow. Samuel stood there, under the glare of the fluorescent light, his chest rising and falling as though he had run a long march. The papers lay sprawled across the table, creased and bent, but the truth printed clear. On record, he remained the husband. On record, he remained the father. But inside these walls, his presence meant nothing. He was a man standing outside his own life. He dropped into a chair, bent forward, palms pressed against his face. His breath came ragged, scraping his lungs. Outside, the sky had begun to pale, dawn stretching across the fields. Birds stirred, their songs fragile in the stillness. But in Samuel's chest, there was no light, no birdsong, only a dense, black silence pressing heavy. The silence of a man who realized he had returned not to a home, but to a place where he was no longer needed. After the kitchen confrontation, taut as a wire stretched to snapping, Samuel stepped out onto the back porch. The air of early morning carried a chill, sharp, but not bitter. The kind of cold that touched skin like a reminder that the world kept moving without you. The sun had just begun to lift over the line of hills, its gold spilling slanted across the wide lawn. His boots pressed against the old wooden steps, and the porch boards creaked beneath his weight, the same familiar sound that once anchored afternoons when he carved wood by hand. When he steadied Eli wobbling on a small bicycle, his boy's laughter ringing like a bell through the yard. Now that same creak felt hollow, no echo waiting for it, only silence answering back. Out across the grass, the yard came alive in a scene that struck Samuel like a blade. There was Eli, dressed in a practice uniform, his small frame swallowed by a leather glove too big for his hand. Facing him was Mark Turner, tossing baseballs with steady rhythm, his voice booming encouragements into the crisp air. Each pitch arced forward, and Eli swung, clumsy and earnest, sometimes missing entirely, sometimes grazing the ball just enough to feel contact. And each time, hit or miss, Mark laughed loud and easy, the kind of laugh that draws another along. Eli laughed too, and together their sound carried across the yard like a memory rewritten with new actors. Samuel froze at the porch rail, his hand gripping the splintered wood until his knuckles ached. Baseball. That had been their game, his and Eli's. On rare leave, he had spent hours out here, crouched behind the plate, showing his boy how to hold the bat, how to keep his eyes on the ball, how to drop his shoulder and swing smooth. The sound of Eli's small feet pounding the grass had been his reward. The boy's grin wide enough to outshine the Sunday. Those moments had etched themselves deep, the rhythm of father and son stitched into the pulse of his heart. And now that same memory replayed before his eyes. Only the man on the mound was not him. "Dad, throw it again." Eli's voice rang out, bright and sure. The word carved Samuel open. Dad. Directed not at him but at Mark. A word that was supposed to be his alone. Mark chuckled, lobbed another ball. This time Eli connected, the crack sharp, the ball bouncing farther across the grass. Eli shouted with pride, and Mark stepped forward, ruffling his hair, praise spilling easy from his mouth. Samuel's eyes stung at the sight of his son's joy. He could not blame the boy. No child can be faulted for clinging to the hand that is there, for soaking in the voice that answers each day. It was Samuel who had left. He had abandoned the role, leaving a vacancy that life had dutifully filled, but knowing that truth did not soften the blow. Watching another man fill the space he had carved with his own blood and bone felt like watching his heart ground into ash. Then Eli turned. His eyes, bright and searching, landed on Samuel standing under the porch shadow. The world seemed to still. In that frozen moment, Samuel saw recognition spark. Eli's eyes widened, lit as if some hidden truth had just surfaced. His mouth opened, trembling on the edge of sound. Samuel heard it half-formed, raw, breaking loose from deep inside. "Da." But the word caught in his throat. Eli bit his lip hard, snapped his head away, and threw the ball back into his glove, pretending to lock his focus on the game. Samuel's heart lurched. He had heard it half of a word, unfinished, smothered before it could live. But that half was enough. Enough to know that Eli remembered. Enough to know he was not erased. Not entirely. His son carried the memory, buried and hidden, forced down beneath new names and new habits, but not gone. The distance between them yawned wide, more visible now than any fence or line of chalk. On one side stood Samuel, tethered to the past, aching for what had been. On the other side stood Eli, anchored in the present, where another man's shadow had grown tall. Between them stretched the white line of a baseball diamond, drawn invisible but real, a boundary the boy did not dare cross. Mark turned then, catching sight of Samuel. His face flickered with surprise, only for a second before sliding back into casual ease. "Morning," he called, his voice pitched loud, carrying for Eli to hear. "You're up early." Samuel said nothing. His eyes never left his son. Eli kept his back turned, fumbling with his shoelaces as if they needed urgent fixing. His fingers shook, his motions clumsy, betraying what his silence tried to hide. Samuel descended 2 steps, stopping at the edge where porch met grass. He did not go closer. The urge to stride forward, to gather his boy in his arms, to hear the full word, "Dad," spill free, it almost broke him. But something heavier pinned him back. Fear. Fear of breaking the fragile moment. Fear of adding weight to the boy's burden. He held still. "Keep at it, Eli," he called softly, his voice rough, cracked with gravel. For a heartbeat, Eli looked up. Their eyes locked, just for half a second, and Samuel saw color bloom in his son's face, saw the battle raging beneath that silence. Then Eli snapped his gaze away, cheeks burning red, lips pressed tight. Mark laid a hand on Eli's shoulder, steady, firm. "Come on, son," he said, voice calm, with a sidelong glance at Samuel, sharp with meaning. "We're not done yet." Samuel felt the cord tightening around him, invisible but suffocating. His boy held his true feelings clenched tight, while habit pulled him toward the man who had been constant. Mark's daily presence had become a claim, a weight pressing Samuel out of frame. And Samuel, the father by blood, stood at the border of his own life, an outsider looking in. A gust swept across the yard, carrying the smell of cut grass. The crack of bat against ball echoed, followed by Eli's restrained cheer. Yet through it all, Samuel heard only that stifled half-word, "Da," a sound cut short, echoing endlessly inside him like a voice lost in a cavern. He stepped back, retreating to the porch. He would not shatter the delicate balance, not yet. But the fracture in his chest deepened, splitting wider. Behind him, Mark's voice carried on, steady, confident. "Eyes on the ball, Eli. That's it. Just like that." His tone brimmed with certainty, as if he were the only father the boy had ever known. Samuel lowered himself to the porch step, elbows braced on his knees, hands gripping tight. He clung to one truth. Eli had almost said it. Almost. That was the ember, the fragile flicker of hope. His son had not forgotten. Not completely. But hope alone was not enough. The gap could not be bridged with words. It would take presence, patience, and the long fight back into a life already claimed by another. And Samuel, weary from years of war, wondered if he had the strength left to walk that road. The sun climbed higher, throwing light full onto the grass. In its brightness, Samuel watched the shadows stretch. Mark's and Eli's figures merged on the lawn, cast long and fused, resembling the outline of a complete family. Meanwhile, his own shadow clung short to the porch, apart, smaller, stranded. He drew a deep breath, forcing back the tears burning his throat. Soldiers are trained not to cry, to bury grief where no one can see. But fatherhood is no battlefield. It cuts deeper, sharper, and nothing Samuel had faced in combat compared to this standing a few yards from his son, close enough to touch, close enough to hear half a word, yet unable to claim the one name that should have been his alone. Night came down slow over the town, spreading itself thick and heavy like a dark blanket. The sky was bare of stars, the clouds drifting in silence, black shapes rolling across each other. A cold wind slipped through the branches, threading its way down the street, carrying with it the dry smell of earth and the faint trace of wood smoke rising from far-off kitchens. Samuel walked out to the front yard, where his old truck sat waiting like an animal too stubborn to die, a tired beast faithful enough to stay put. He didn't turn back toward the kitchen glowing with light behind him. He didn't want to hear the laughter again, or the familiar tones of conversation carried in another man's voice. The porch light cast his shadow long and crooked on the ground, dragging it behind him, as if even the house refused to claim it. He pulled open the truck door, climbed into the cab, and shut himself in with a heavy slam, sealing himself away from everything that used to be his. Inside he sat still, listening to the sound of his own heart beating hard in the dark. The cab smelled of old leather, motor oil, and the stale ghost of cigarettes smoked years ago. It was the scent of his past. This truck had been part of every chapter that mattered. It had carried him and Anna on their first summer evening drive, had carried Eli home from the hospital in a blanket, the baby's cries louder than the engine itself. And then, on the day he left for war, it had been parked in the same spot, silent witness to Anna turning her face away to hide tears he never got to wipe. The truck remembered what he wished he could forget. He leaned back into the seat, pulling his old army jacket close against him. The chill settled into his bones, but he didn't start the heater. He welcomed the cold. It kept him awake, reminded him he was still alive. Through the windshield he saw the porch light trembling in the wind, a soft gold reminder that the world inside that house went on without him. The night spoke in hushed tones. Insects rasped their steady chorus. Wind combed across the fields, brushing the grass with long, invisible hands. Together, they formed a kind of music, quiet, indifferent. Samuel closed his eyes, searching for rest, but images from the day still beat against the walls of his mind. Eli choking back the word Dad and swallowing it, Mark smiling with confidence, the wedding photo with his face cut away, each memory pressed sharp into his chest until breathing hurt. He shifted in the seat, moving his hand to adjust himself, when his fingers caught against something wedged in the crack of the seat, something rigid. He reached in, tugged, and pulled out an envelope, old, yellowed at the edges, a layer of dust clinging to it as if it had been hiding there for years. Samuel blinked, held it closer to the faint light seeping in through the glass. His breath caught. The handwriting was unmistakable. Anna's, tilted, hurried, but hers. The single word scrawled across the front, Samuel. His throat closed tight. His hands trembled as he opened the flap and pulled out a single sheet, folded into quarters. The paper was thin, fragile with time, but the writing was still clear. If you don't come back, I will have to find someone else to take care of our son. Samuel went still. The words pierced him clean through, a blade straight into his chest. Not long, not complete, just a handful of words, but heavy enough to crush whatever illusions he had managed to carry. He read them again, then again, each word landing like a hammer blow. If you don't come back, a beginning that sounded half like fear, half like prophecy. I will have to find someone else. And now, staring at it in the dim glow, he knew the truth of it. Anna had done just that. Someone else was in the house. Someone else was throwing baseballs in the yard. Someone else was lying in his bed. The letter slipped to his lap, and his hands covered his face. Heat broke through. Tears he thought long buried forced their way out, streaking down between his fingers. He had believed himself hardened, forged by years of loss. The sight of men falling beside him, the repeated confrontation with death. He thought nothing could undo him. Yet here he was, undone not by war, but by a scrap of paper, by the familiar touch of a pen he had once watched her hold. He leaned back against the seat, his eyes rising to the truck's roof. Rust stains and thin cracks spidered across the metal above him, each one a scar, each one a mirror of his own fractures. He had cracked long ago, on the day he walked away from this place, and now those fractures had finally split apart. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the truck door. Samuel clutched the letter tight in both hands, the paper light yet heavier than stone. Memory returned unbidden. The last morning before he left, Anna holding Eli against her chest, her eyes red, rimmed but her voice firm. She hadn't spoken much, only whispered, "Keep yourself safe." He had carried that whisper through battle, through nights when survival seemed impossible. It was the thread that had held him together. But now, he realized, there had been another thread, another word meant for him, a letter that never made it into his hands, a letter that had lain hidden under this seat, shaping his fate without his knowing. He folded the letter again, slid it back into its envelope, and pressed it to his chest. His breathing shook. The question circled, merciless. If she had given it to him back then, if he had known, would he still have gone? Would he have walked away? Would everything be different now? No answer came. Only the sound of wind slipping through the cracks, and the metallic tick of the cooling engine, like the faint beat of an old clock marking time's relentless passage. Samuel closed his eyes, and he let the tears fall. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry, not for comrades, not for war, but for the one thing war could never give back, his family. The truck shuddered softly under the push of the night wind. In that darkness, the shape of an old soldier sat slumped in the cab, clutching a yellowed envelope, as still and broken as a statue abandoned in the field. The next morning, Samuel woke in the truck, his head tipped against the cold window, his body bent stiff from the night. His hand was still clutching the envelope tight to his chest, as if he had been guarding it even in sleep. His neck ached, his back throbbed all the way down his spine, and the chill of the night still clung to his skin. When he finally opened his eyes, pale morning light was cutting through the dusty glass, falling in thin beams across the cracked dashboard and the worn seat. He rubbed at his forehead, and for a moment the weight of his body felt doubled, every muscle dragging heavy as stone. In his mind, the words from the old letter still rang clear and merciless. If you don't come back, I will have to find someone else to take care of our son. He tucked the envelope into the inside pocket of his jacket, held it close, then pushed open the door. The morning air was crisp and biting, sharp enough to make him shiver. He drew a long breath, steadying himself. Ahead, the house stood quiet, the curtains stirring faintly in the breeze. He knew he could not keep circling the edges forever. It was time to face what waited inside. Samuel's boots carried him slow across the floorboards, each step measured. The house was still, no voices, only the tick of the wall clock keeping count. He passed the living room, the hall, until he stopped at the kitchen doorway. Anna was there. She wore a thin grey sweater, her hair pulled back hastily. She stood angled toward the sink, sleeves pushed up, her hands lost in dishes and running water. The small square window above her let in a shaft of daylight that lay across her cheek and jaw. Samuel stood watching, and for a moment it was as if time had folded in on itself. The years apart had dissolved, and she was simply there again, leaning over the sink, tending to the ordinary business of keeping a home alive. It was almost enough to believe the last decade had been a bad dream. His voice came out rough, low. "Anna." She stopped, her shoulders jolted, then stilled. Slowly she turned. When her eyes met his, something flickered there. Not surprise, not joy. Something harder to place, an unsettled confusion, as though she had been caught in the middle of hiding something she never meant to show. "You came back," she said softly, her voice hardly more than breath. Samuel nodded. "I came back." The silence that followed pressed down like weight. The water dripped from the faucet in steady rhythm, filling the space words refused to cover. Samuel stepped forward into the kitchen. "I've seen it," he said, his tone deliberate, controlled. "Mark, Eli." The photograph on the refrigerator. Anna's lips pressed tight, her fingers wringing the dishcloth in her hands. Her eyes lowered, fixed on the floor, refusing the line of his gaze. "I don't blame you," Samuel went on, his voice quieter, heavier. "I know I was gone too long. I know what I left behind. But there's one thing I need to understand. Why? Why did it all turn out this way? Why does my son carry another man's name?" At that, Anna lifted her eyes to his, and in them Samuel saw not just guilt or weariness. He saw something layered deeper, regret, tangled with dread, sorrow knotted with something darker still. The look unsettled him, chilled him more than anger or rejection ever could. "You wouldn't understand," she whispered. "Then help me," Samuel said, stepping closer, his voice harder. "Make me understand." She shifted back half a step until her spine touched the edge of the counter. Her teeth caught her lip, her gaze unsteady. Then she dropped the cloth and gripped the counter with both hands, knuckles whitening, her whole frame trembling. "When you left, everything collapsed on me. The bills, the work, a child who wasn't grown yet. I tried everything I could. But some things were bigger than me." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "What things?" Anna's silence answered first. Only her breath, sharp and shallow. She turned her head toward the window, staring out at the strip of sunlight sliding across the table. "Mark helped me," she said at last, the words breaking loose reluctantly. "He was here when I needed someone. He paid off debts, patched the roof, drove Eli to school, to doctors when I couldn't. He filled the space I couldn't fill. And it turned into this." Samuel's hands curled into fists at his sides, the bones whitening under his skin. His voice came low, iron heavy. "I hear you, but there's something else. I saw it in your eyes just now. This isn't only guilt, there's more." Anna turned back to him, and in that instant the fear shone through. Not fear of Samuel himself, but of something unseen, looming larger than either of them. "You're hiding something," he said, his brow furrowed deep. She said nothing. Tears pooled, and she spun back toward the sink, scrubbing at a plate already spotless, her hands clumsy, desperate for escape. Samuel moved closer, lowering his voice. "I found the letter, Anna, in the truck. You wrote, 'If you don't come back, I'll have to find someone else to take care of our son.' You kept that promise, but your eyes now, they tell me there's more than that. What is it you're not telling me?" Her hands froze. She dropped the plate into the rack with a clatter. Turning back to him, tears spilling now, she shook her head violently. "I can't," she choked out. "Not now. Not here." The words staggered Samuel. He had braced himself for confessions about love lost, about loyalties shifted. He had not expected this trembling refusal, this fear leaking through her eyes. It hinted at something beyond the walls of this house, something darker lurking behind every silence. He stepped back, his breath heavy, chest tightening as if he had walked into a battlefield unseen. The question roared in his mind, relentless. What is she afraid of? Was it Mark? Or something larger, a shadow neither of them had yet named? The kitchen fell into quiet again. Only the tick of the clock filled the air, and the steady drum of Samuel's heart pounding inside his chest like distant artillery. Samuel stepped out of the kitchen after his exchange with Anna, and his pulse hammered harder than it ever had during an ambush in Iraq. It wasn't guilt in her eyes that unsettled him. It was fear, subtle, hidden, clinging to her like the damp weight of night fog. A soldier seasoned in war knew the difference. Guilt faded quickly. Fear lingered, whispering of something deeper, something unnamed. He hadn't pressed her further. Years of combat had taught him when to drive forward and when to step back. Stepping back did not mean surrender, it meant listening, watching, waiting for the truth to reveal itself in its own time. On the porch, evening bent low across the land. The sun, sinking toward the horizon, spilled red and gold over the fields, laying long shadows across the grass. Samuel lowered himself onto the old wooden steps, his bones aching from the weight of the day. The wind moved in from the open country, carrying the scents of dry grass and damp soil. He pulled a crumpled pack of cigarettes from his pocket, tapping one against his thumb before flicking his lighter. Flame flared, smoke curled upward in a thin spiral, carried off slowly by the breeze. He drew in deep, leaned his back against the porch post, and let memory rise. Fallujah. Nights so dark they swallowed men whole. The silence, broken by shallow breaths of soldiers, pressed against dirt, the sharp sting of gunpowder lingering in the air. And then, without warning, the eruption rifle fire tearing through the quiet, screams cut short, blood-soaking sand. He remembered the ones who fell, who never came home, faces that still surfaced when he closed his eyes. He had thought he left those ghosts behind overseas. But here, on the steps of the house that used to be his, the past returned sharp and vivid, as if he were still crouched in those ruins. He closed his eyes against the sting of smoke. One by one, the faces of his brothers in arms came, men he hadn't said goodbye to. The same question pressed on him now, as it had every mile of his journey home. Why am I the one who survived? Survival carried no reward if, in the end, there was no home left for him to belong to. His phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him upright. He pulled it free, the old model lit up against the dusk. One new message. He narrowed his eyes and read, "You don't know the whole story. Don't trust Mark." One line. No name, no signature, just a string of numbers he didn't recognize. His brow furrowed, a vein tightening at his temple. Somebody was watching. Not just watching him, but watching everything that happened inside that house. He dragged smoke deep into his lungs, exhaling slow and heavy. His instincts sharpened. This was no longer only about family or betrayal. Something wider, darker, had its hands in this. Anna's look, fear that had nothing to do with love lost, suddenly made sense. Maybe this message was the key to it. Samuel sat motionless, scanning the horizon. The land lay still, painted in twilight, but its calm felt wrong. Too clean, too staged. Far across the field, crows wheeled in jagged circles, their shadows streaking over the grass. No human figure broke the line, but his gut told him what his eyes could not see. The feeling of being observed was one he trusted. It had saved his life too many times before. Silence on a battlefield almost always meant danger. He opened the message again, reading slowly. Each word etched itself into his mind. Don't trust Mark. Mark's voice from the night before echoed in memory. Anna never signed the divorce papers. I was here when you weren't. Too calm, too steady, too rehearsed. And now this warning, slipping in from nowhere, pieced together a picture Samuel hadn't dared to frame. Mark's confidence had not been casual, it had been built on something else. Something hidden. He ground out the cigarette on the porch step, tucked the phone into his pocket, and held still, listening. The yard darkened, shadows flooding the grass, the house now a silhouette against the deepening sky. Every sound was magnified, the rasp of crickets, the creak of the back door moving with the breeze, footsteps padding faintly inside the house. Samuel's chest rose slow, his heartbeat measured, but his mind turned like a wheel in fire. Who had sent the message? A comrade who'd kept eyes on him all these years? A neighbor who'd seen too much? Or someone inside the house slipping warnings under a mask? He pulled Anna's envelope from his jacket pocket, unfolding the letter once again. The line cut through him anew. If you don't come back, I will have to find someone else to take care of our son. He held the paper beside the message on his phone. The two together painted something he hadn't considered. Maybe this wasn't just about love abandoned or loyalties shifted. Maybe someone had pushed events, manipulated outcomes until the pieces fell this way. Samuel rubbed his temples hard, exhaling. The air carried a sharp, earthy tang as the wind picked up, colder now, swirling across the porch. He tugged the jacket closer around him, though the chill came not from weather but from the suspicion tightening around him like rope. The phone vibrated again, sharp in his hand. His breath caught, but when he lit the screen, no new words appeared, only the warning of low battery blinking red. He exhaled, but the unease remained. It was as if someone had laughed in the shadows behind him. He turned his head fast, scanning the yard. Empty. Only darkness and the whisper of grass bending under the wind. He stood, his boots carrying him out onto the lawn. Every step cracked the grass beneath him, each sound too loud. The air was alive with movement, branches rattling, crickets hissing, his ears searching for something out of place. Then, far beyond the fence line, a pair of headlights flickered once before vanishing. He narrowed his eyes, but the moment was gone. He walked back to the porch and lowered himself onto the step again. The feeling that pressed against his chest was one he knew well. The tense breath before a strike, the awareness that an attack was waiting in the silence. Someone, somewhere, had their sights on him, waiting for him to falter. He gripped the phone in his hand, repeated the words silently. You don't know the whole story. Don't trust Mark. Darkness sealed the yard. The crickets sang louder. Samuel lit another cigarette, the glow flaring briefly against his tired face. He blew smoke into the night and kept his gaze on the horizon. He knew now. This homecoming was no longer about reclaiming a place at his family's table. It had shifted. It had become a war fought in shadows, a war without uniforms or front lines, a war laced through the walls of his own house, and like every war before, he would have to fight it. Retreat was not an option. The morning broke pale and uneven, sunlight slanting through the trees, spilling across the lawn in patchwork. Samuel stirred awake in the driver's seat of the truck, his body stiff from another night folded into its narrow frame. His head felt like stone, his muscles aching as though the steel springs of the seat had pressed into him all night long. He rubbed his temples, his throat parched and raw. The bitterness of last night's cigarette still clung to his lips. He pushed open the door, stepped down into the damp grass. The air smelled of wet earth and freshly cut lawn, cool enough to bite. From inside the house came the sound of a door opening, light footsteps pattering across the floorboards, then down the porch steps. Samuel turned, and his chest tightened. Eli emerged into the yard. The boy wore an old t-shirt and shorts, his hair tousled from sleep. In his hand he carried a baseball glove, the leather edges frayed with age. His eyes scanned the yard quickly, then fell on Samuel. For a brief moment their gazes met, and Samuel felt his pulse kick. But almost as quickly, Eli lowered his head and walked forward slowly, his shoulders hunched inward, as though bracing himself. Samuel stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. The distance between them felt wider than any battlefield he had crossed, the air heavy with all that was unsaid. When only a few steps remained, Eli stopped. He lifted his head, his eyes flickering between light and shadow, caught in some internal fight. Then, in a sudden movement, He raised the glove to his chest and extended it outward with both hands. His voice, small but steady, broke the silence. "This is for you, Dad." The word cracked Samuel open. Dad. Fragile as a breath, soft as a whisper, but real. His throat constricted. He reached forward, careful, afraid that if he moved too fast the moment itself might shatter. His hands closed around the glove, taking it as though it were a sacred relic. The leather was worn smooth, its seams split in places, the edges unraveling. Recognition surged through him. This was the same glove he had bought Eli at a county fair when the boy was 6. He remembered the way Eli had clutched it tight, eyes wide with joy, begging to practice right there in the dust of the fairgrounds. Samuel had thought the glove lost long ago, discarded with childhood years. Yet here it was, carried back into his hands, like a fragile bridge stretched between past and present. "Thank you, son," Samuel whispered, his voice trembling. Eli said nothing. He only nodded once, then backed away. His small frame turned, legs moving faster, carrying him toward the back of the house. From behind came Mark's voice, sharp and commanding, echoing across the yard. "Hurry up, Eli, we've got more practice to do." Samuel stood still, holding the glove against his chest. He lifted it to his face and breathed in the faint smell aged leather, sweat of a child, years pressed into the seams. The ache rose in his throat, eyes stinging. But then, as he turned the glove over, his fingers brushed something rigid hidden inside. He reached in and drew out a slip of paper, small, folded clumsily, its edges creased and wrinkled. His pulse quickened. Carefully, he unfolded it. The handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged, unmistakably the hand of a child. But the words were clear enough. "He is not a good man." Samuel's breath stopped. His eyes locked on the line as though it had detonated inside his skull. His hands trembled around the paper, gripping it tight as if it were life itself. A gust of wind swept the yard, rattling dry leaves across the ground. Samuel lifted his head, scanning the horizon. The grass swayed, the morning light fell warm across the field, and in the distance he heard Mark laughing, Eli's bat striking ball. On the surface, it was the picture of peace, but in Samuel's hand was proof of another truth, one hidden beneath the smiles. He folded the note, slid it into his pocket, his breathing sharp and uneven, the words repeated inside him, pounding with the rhythm of his heart. He is not a good man. There was no doubt who had written it. Eli, somehow, had slipped this note into the old glove, a small act, but heavy with meaning. A gesture of trust, a cry for help, a truth the boy could not bring himself to speak aloud. Samuel turned toward the house, eyes searching for his son's shape. Eli had already disappeared behind the corner, swallowed by Mark's voice urging him on. The sound of bat against ball carried back, Mark's laughter rising with it, but to Samuel, the laughter was hollow now, stripped of warmth. It rang false, laced with deceit. He walked back to the porch, lowered himself onto the old chair, the glove resting on his knees, his hand closed around it tight, his chest beating hard against his ribs. In his mind, the pieces began to align. Anna's haunted eyes, the anonymous message warning, "Don't trust Mark," and now this secret note from his son. All of them pointed to the same truth. Mark Turner was no simple man, no ordinary presence in this house. Samuel stared across the fields. The wind gathered strength, bending the tall grass, pulling the clouds into thicker clusters. He understood now. He could no longer stand on the outside, watching. His son was reaching out to him, risking silence to deliver the truth. And Samuel, no matter how long he had been gone, no matter how much he had been replaced, was still the boy's father. He could not turn away. He pulled the paper from his pocket once more, tracing the uneven letters with his thumb. Beyond the yard, Eli's voice carried, tangled with Mark's. "Keep your balance. That's it, son." Samuel closed his eyes, holding the note tight in his fist. The wind roared across the porch, scattering dust at his feet. Within that rush of sound, Samuel swore to himself, the truth would come out, and this time, he would not walk away. The afternoon sagged toward dusk, sunlight slanting low through the trees, dropping tired streaks of gold across the yard. Samuel sat on the porch steps, the old baseball glove resting heavy in his lap. In his jacket pocket lay the folded scrap of paper Eli had hidden inside, and every time his hand drifted there, his pulse thudded like a drum. "He is not a good man." 4 small words, but heavy as an entire battlefield. From across the grass came the sound of laughter, Mark's voice lifting, Eli's joining in, the crack of bat against ball carrying clear in the open air. But the laughter no longer pierced Samuel with longing. Instead, it pulled him taut, stretched him like wire ready to snap. He knew the moment had come. He could not remain silent. The back door swung open. Mark stepped out, a thin shirt clinging damp with sweat across his chest, confidence radiating in his stride. He carried himself with the ease of a man who had long claimed this ground as his own. His eyes found Samuel on the steps, and he walked toward him without pause. "We need to talk," Mark said, his tone flat, steady. Samuel gave a short nod, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yeah." They sat facing each other, no more than a few steps apart, the wooden planks groaning under their weight. The breeze shifted through the fields, rattling the porch beams until they creaked. For a long while, neither spoke. Only the tick of the house clock echoed faintly through the walls, each beat marking time's cold rhythm. At last, Mark broke the silence. "I'm not a thief. I never meant to take what wasn't mine. I only tried to fill the void you left. A boy needs a father present. I was that man. That's all I've ever done. Samuel lifted his eyes, steady and sharp. Fill the void? Or exploit it? Mark's head snapped, eyes narrowing. What are you saying? You know what I'm saying. Samuel's voice was low but hard, iron beneath gravel. I saw Anna's eyes. I saw the fear buried there. I got a message last night, from someone who knows more than I do, someone telling me not to trust you. And now, he leaned forward, voice sinking deeper. Now I hold proof from my son's own hand. You are not what you pretend to be. A shadow crossed Mark's face. He barked out a laugh, short and humorless, his lips curling but his eyes dead flat. So that's the game? You come back after years gone, spinning stories, clawing for ground you abandoned? Eli's happy with me. Anna needs me. You're just a ghost stumbling back to a life that moved on. Samuel's fists clenched at his sides, but his voice stayed level. If you were truly the man you claim to be, Eli wouldn't have had to hide a note in an old glove, warning me you weren't good. If you were truly good, Anna wouldn't tremble when she looked at me. For the first time, the mask cracked. Mark's calm faltered, his face hardening. He leaned forward, bracing an elbow on his knee, his voice gritting out. Watch what you're saying. I was here when you weren't. I raised your boy. I paid the debts, fixed the roof, kept this place standing. You didn't. You think you have the right to judge me? Samuel rose slowly, his frame towering, shadows spilling long across Mark's. His words rumbled deep, final. I'm his father. His blood runs in me, and I've come back to reclaim the truth whether you want it or not. Mark's eyes flared with heat. He surged to his feet, standing nose to nose with Samuel. The space between them narrowed to a breath, the air thick, unmoving, as though the land itself was waiting for the strike. His jaw tightened, teeth grinding. Then the words slipped out, sharp and reckless. If you hadn't disappeared all those years, I never would have had the chance. The confession hung in the air, heavy as gunfire. Both men froze, the world caught in its echo. Samuel's gaze sharpened, certainty cutting through him. Mark had just exposed himself. And then, Del, the voice cracked the moment apart. They turned. At the edge of the yard stood Eli, his bat slipping from his hands to the grass. His eyes were wide, shocked, his small body trembling at what he had just heard. Mark's face drained of color. He forced a smile, thin and brittle. Eli, listen. Stop. Eli's voice burst, breaking but firm. His small chest heaved, his words shaking but true. I heard everything. Samuel's heart slammed inside him. He saw the boy's lip tremble, his shoulders quake. He saw the way Eli's eyes locked on his, wet with tears but burning with recognition. The boy's mouth worked, forming the word he had held back so many times. Dad. This time it broke free, whole and undeniable. Mark's face twisted, his confidence collapsing into something raw, cornered. His own words had trapped him, and there was no pulling them back. His hands curled tight, jaw set, but the damage was done. The wind swept hard across the yard, leaves scraping in dry whispers. Samuel drew in a breath, heavy with pain, heavy with fury. But above all, he felt the shift, something turning in that moment. The truth, long buried, had begun to surface, and no man, no lie, could bury it again. Night settled thick over the countryside, a darkness as familiar as it was unforgiving. Out here, there were no street lamps, only the pale suggestion of a moon half buried behind clouds, and the faint glow of fireflies rising from the grass. Samuel sat in the cab of his old truck, the door cracked open, his body slouched back against the seat. The worn baseball glove rested on his lap, and in his pocket was the folded scrap of paper his son had left for him. Every detail of the last days looped in his head. Anna's frightened eyes, Mark's slip of the tongue, the half-strangled dad that Eli had finally forced out. Each memory knotted together into a rope that bound him, pulling him toward a place he could no longer turn away from. He lit a cigarette, the tip glowing briefly in the darkness, before smoke spread in thin curls around the cab. His chest felt heavy, his pulse slow but relentless. A part of him longed to drive away, to leave this place behind, to escape the swamp of memory and wounds that had no hope of healing. But another part, the deeper part, refused. For the first time in years, his son had reached toward him, had slipped a secret note into his hands. To leave now would not only be desertion, it would be betrayal of the boy himself. Samuel ground the cigarette out against the metal ashtray, pushed the door open, and stepped into the chill of night. The wind cut through his jacket, raising gooseflesh on his arms. He started across the yard, meaning to walk the edge of the fields, to quiet the storm in his head. But then he froze. A sound, faint, from inside the house, wood creaking, subtle but enough. His ears, trained by years of listening for enemy movements in the dark, caught it instantly. He went still, his body tense, every nerve alert. He moved toward the porch, boots barely brushing the ground. The house stood in shadows, save for the thin strip of light leaking from the living room door. He halted, breath held, listening. Another sound. A metallic scrape, soft, deliberate, like a hinge turning, a safe. His memory flared. Years ago, Anna had kept a small safe under the living room floorboards, a place for deeds, insurance papers, documents that defined ownership and life. He never thought it would survive the years, but he knew the sound now. Someone was opening it. He did not barge inside. Instinct told him to watch before acting. He circled back to the truck, pulled open the rear compartment. Inside lay the scattered remnants of his past. A few tools, a coil of rope, an old tablet. The tablet had been a gift from a comrade when he left service, a piece of technology he rarely touched, but buried in it was a program he had once used. Before leaving years ago, he had installed a small camera in Eli's room, a poor attempt at staying close from a distance. He had nearly forgotten it, but the software remained. His pulse climbed. He powered the tablet. The screen flickered to life, light cutting across his face in the dark cab. He tapped, swiped, waited for the feed to load. The image was grainy, unsteady, but the outline was unmistakable. Eli's room, door ajar, the lens angled enough to catch a slice of the living room floor. Samuel zoomed in. There. A figure crouched low over the boards, back turned, shoulders broad. The light from a small flashlight caught the outline. He knew the shape, the posture. Mark Turner. Samuel's lungs clamped tight. On screen, Mark peeled the rug back, pried up the wooden hatch, and pulled the safe into view. From his shirt pocket came a ring of keys, tested one by one, his hands practiced, precise. Not a man fumbling in secret, but one rehearsed, confident, as if he had done this many times before. A moment later, the lock gave with a faint click. The lid swung open. Samuel's heart hammered. Mark rifled quickly through the stack inside, flipping page after page. The flashlight beam lit his face, enough to reveal the curve of a smile, thin, victorious. He separated out several sheets, tucking them neatly aside, the property deed, household registration, the certificate of ownership, the very heart of the house, of the family's future. Samuel's hands shook. At last, every piece locked together Anna's terror, Eli's secret note, the anonymous warning. Mark had never been filling a void. He had been maneuvering step by step to make the house and the land his own. He wasn't building trust, he was building possession. On screen, Mark slid the papers into a brown envelope, tucked it inside his shirt. He closed the safe, lowered the hatch, laid the rug back over, every movement smooth, methodical. A man who knew exactly what he was doing. Samuel sat paralyzed, watching. The rage surged hot through him, but he fought to keep it down. The war inside this house would not be won with fists or bullets. Not now. This was a war of shadows, where proof was the only weapon that mattered. He shut the tablet, gripping it tight, his breath ragged. The night wind howled against the eaves, rattling the boards. Through the window, he saw Mark's silhouette moving, climbing the stairs. The man vanished into the upper rooms, leaving the house dark again. Samuel leaned forward, hands trembling against the steering wheel. The old glove lay on the seat, the child's note in his pocket burning against his chest. The question rose and pounded in his skull. What now? Run or stay? If he left, he lost everything. His son, his house, the truth itself. If he stayed, he entered another kind of battle, silent, ruthless, one fought with patience and evidence, a war no less dangerous than the desert. He closed his eyes, drawing in a slow, burning breath. He listened to the rhythm of night, the insects, the wind, his own heartbeat echoing like drums of war. Then he opened his eyes, set his jaw, and knew the answer. He would not leave. Not again. The wail of police sirens tore through the dull afternoon air. Blue and red lights strobed across the weathered siding of the old house, bouncing in restless flashes across windows clouded with dust. Tires bit into gravel as two patrol cars ground to a halt, their wheels grinding down the brittle grass. Neighbors began to gather at a cautious distance, faces caught between curiosity and unease. Mark Turner stood in the yard, wrists bound in steel. His face was a mask of bruises, blood crusted at his lip. Two officers flanked him, steadying him as they led him toward the cruiser. His head turned once, eyes burning with hatred, locking on Samuel. On the porch, Samuel stood breathless, his shirt torn at the shoulder, bruises swelling on his arms. He didn't feel victory in that moment. No triumph, no release. Only the emptiness that comes after a fight has drained everything inside you. Beside him, Anna clutched Eli close. The boy sobbed into her blouse, his small shoulders shuddering, but his gaze never left Samuel. His eyes, wet but certain, carried one truth. He had chosen. He had spoken the word. Dad. And that single word outweighed every loss, every absence. The officers searched Mark and pulled a brown envelope from his pocket. One older policeman slipped it open, rifling through the contents before turning towards Samuel. Mr. Hayes, he said gravely, we'll be sealing this. Looks like deeds and legal documents, likely fraudulent, but it'll take time to verify. At least you've got evidence now. Samuel's voice rasped. Thank you. As the officer folded the envelope closed, Samuel's eyes caught a sliver of something inside a smaller scrap of paper, tucked between the sheets. His chest tightened. Wait, he said, stepping forward. His voice carried weight. Let me see that. There's something in there that doesn't belong. The officer hesitated then, reading the urgency in Samuel's expression, nodded. He pulled the slip free, unfolded it, frowned, then handed it over. Samuel took it, his pulse rising. The paper was rough, edges frayed, ink blotched at the corner. One single line scrawled across in hurried hand. He is only the first. There will be more. The words hit Samuel like a strike to the ribs. Wind tore across the yard, scattering dead leaves in spirals at his feet. The flashing police lights washed the writing in alternating red and blue, making it seem alive, pulsing with menace. His fingers clenched around the slip, a coldness running the length of his spine. Who had written this? Why was it in Mark's possession? And what did more mean? Samuel lifted his eyes, scanning the neighborhood. Darkness crept from the tree line, houses flickered with lamplight, neighbors whispered among themselves. But to him, they all blurred into shadows. The thought pressed hard and immovable. Mark was not alone. He turned back. Anna stood watching him, her face drained of color, confusion, and dread flickering in her eyes. Eli clung to the glove, staring up at him, desperate and anxious. Samuel slipped the paper into his pocket, silent. He would not add weight to their fear, not yet. Mark was forced into the cruiser. Just before the door slammed, he twisted, lips curling into a crooked grin. Not the grin of a man defeated, but of a man who knew more than he had revealed. Samuel saw it in his eyes, something deeper than hate, something connected, larger, hidden. The police cars pulled away, tires spitting dust. The flashing lights faded, the sirens grew distant, and silence reclaimed the yard. Neighbors melted back into their homes, leaving only 3 figures on the porch, still in the grip of wind and cold. Anna laid a trembling hand on Samuel's shoulder. Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry. I made mistakes. But there are things I still can't say." Samuel met her gaze, his own heavy with shadows. "I know, and I know this goes beyond Mark. Something bigger is moving here." Eli stepped forward, his small hand wrapping around Samuel's. For the first time in years, Samuel felt his son's warmth pressed into his palm. He tightened his grip gently, offering a silent promise. That night, the house fell quiet again. Samuel didn't sleep in the truck. He sat in the living room instead, the baseball glove and Eli's note laid out on the table beside the fresh scrap of warning. Upstairs, Anna finally drifted into restless sleep. On the couch, Eli curled against the cushions, exhausted, one hand still clutching the glove. The clock ticked in steady rhythm, the sound loud in the hush. Samuel unfolded the note once more, tracing the words again and again. He is only the first. There will be more. His eyes lifted to the window, where the darkness pressed thick against the glass. He couldn't shake the sense that someone was out there, watching, waiting. He lit a cigarette, the glow flickering across the lines of his weathered face. He had survived war, but this was different. This was a battle without uniforms, without front lines, fought in shadows across his own home. On the sofa, Eli stirred, whispering in his sleep. "Dad." The sound reached Samuel, struck deep. His chest tightened, pain and pride mingling. He leaned forward, eyes hard, knowing the truth. Nothing was finished. The fight had just begun. Outside, the wind scoured the fields, carrying the rustle of leaves like an omen. In his pocket, the slip of paper seemed to pulse cold against his chest. Samuel gripped it tight. The real war was only beginning. The yard lay quiet after the day's storm of chaos. Dust still hovered in the air. Faint traces of rubber clung from the cruiser's tires. The wind rattled the broken fence, its voice low and mournful, as if the house itself labored for breath after a nightmare. Samuel stood in the kitchen, his hands braced on the table. His knuckles were raw, scratched, dried with blood from the fight. He hadn't bothered to wash them. His hands had fired rifles, carried brothers, buried the dead. But tonight they shook for a different reason, because of the look in Eli's eyes when he had finally cried out, "Dad!" On the staircase, Eli sat still, the glove pressed against his chest. The boy wasn't sleeping. Every time Samuel's eyes lifted, Eli's gaze darted away, pretending not to watch him. Anna sat in the living room, lamplight painting her tired face in amber. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the clock's steady ticking and the moan of wind rolling across the fields. At last, Samuel poured a glass of water and sat at the new dining table. Its polished surface gleamed, cold, sterile, nothing like the scarred wooden table that had once held years of meals, birthdays, late-night talks. The shine reflected him back like a stranger. He felt like a guest in a house that should have been his own. The past splintered into fragments. Eli's near whispered, "Dad," in the yard. Anna's laughter years ago, as she set a pie on the old table. Anna's voice broke the quiet. "You'll stay?" He looked up. Her eyes were stripped bare, no masks left, no certainty, only fatigue and a fragile hope. "I don't know," Samuel admitted. The only thing I know is that Eli needs me, and I won't walk away again. Insects. Her chin dipped, tears sliding down her cheeks. On the stairs, Eli's eyes shimmered, drinking in every word. Night deepened, heavy and unyielding. When Eli finally drifted off on the sofa, Samuel laid a blanket across him, then sat beside him, listening to the boy's breathing even out. It was the first fragile peace Samuel had felt in years, but it trembled, precarious, as though it could vanish with the next gust of wind. He lit a cigarette, smoke curling into the dark. On the battlefield, he had once counted cigarettes to measure survival between shell fire. Here, he counted smoke rings to measure the silence of a broken home. Outside the window, moonlight washed across the fields in uneven silver. Samuel remembered a comrade's words, spoken long ago before a firefight. War never ends. It just finds its way home in another form. He understood now. The war was here, in this house, in the fractures no one else could see. Anna placed a cup of tea beside him, the steam rising faintly. She lingered for a moment before stepping away, leaving the small warmth of her gesture behind. Samuel watched her go, sorrow and a spark of faith tangled inside him. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was still ground for them to stand on together. He reached for Eli's hand as the boy stirred in his sleep, whispering softly, "I'll be here, I promise." It was no soldier's oath, no declaration carved in stone. Just a whisper carried into the night, but it weighed heavier than any vow he had ever made. Outside, the fields whispered under the wind. In the darkness, no one could say what was coming, but inside the house, 3 souls shared the same silence, the same fragile breath. For now, that was enough.